Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of US in the City online. It's so exciting this evening because we have a fantastic guest. My name is Rabbi Jonathan Hughes of Radlett United Synagogue and also for US in the City. And our guest this evening is Lord Ian Austin, who is officially titled as the Baron Austin of Dudley. He is a British politician that a lot of us know and love, who sits now as a life peer in the House of Lords. He was the MP for Dudley North from the 2005 general election until the 2019 election, when he stood down before that election in the wake of Labour's anti-Semitism crisis. And therefore, he really fought the fight that we all felt at that time. And he resigned as a Labour MP at that time to sit as an independent. And indeed, after the election, he was ennobled in Boris Johnson's Disillusioned Honours List in 2020. He served as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Department for Communities and Local Government from 2009 to 10. But really, he is a personal hero of mine, having worked with him and seen him in action. And I think it was a point of interest for our community to reach out to Ian at this time and say, can we ask you a few questions? And that's what we have this evening. So I'd like to welcome Ian Austin.
Hi. Hi, Rabbi Hughes. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's a great privilege for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much for making the time for us. We know you're very busy, and it's just a pleasure and an honor to be able to talk to you this evening. And I'm sure a lot of people will have questions, and I encourage people to write in their questions. You can type them into the chat bars and the various forums that people are on. So hopefully they'll be able to ask a few questions that we can fire later, Q&A. But for now, Ian, I just wanted to start from the very beginning, really. Could you maybe give us an insight into your background, starting with your childhood?
Sure, yeah. Well, look, I grew up in Dudley. My dad was a local head teacher. My mum was a teacher. I was adopted. In fact, all four of us were adopted. My dad was a refugee who came here in 1939. He's Jewish. He came from a place called Ostrava in what was then Czechoslovakia, way over in the eastern part of what's now the Czech Republic, pretty close to the border with Poland. He lived with his mum and two elder sisters. And in 1939, in March 1939, after the German invasion, after the Nazis had invaded, he managed to escape. He came to the UK. It wasn't on the Kinder transport. It was a private arrangement. And his dad had died when he was a baby. His mum ran a shop in the town. And she and his sisters were unable to escape, couldn't leave. And they ended up being rounded up, and they were sent first to a ghetto and then to Theresienstadt, and then eventually to Treblinka, where they were murdered in October 1942. So we grew up not in a, I mean, my mum was an English Methodist, not from a, so we didn't grow up in a Jewish household. And I wouldn't describe myself as Jewish. But we grew up learning about, the Holocaust, occasionally attending, we went to bar mitzvahs of cousins and things like that. But we didn't really have I don't think, my dad didn't grow up in a religious household in Ostrava. They went to synagogue on sort of holy days and festivals and things, but they weren't a particularly religious family. And he had no real connection with Judaism after he'd left Ostrava. He lived with, with non-Jewish, in a non-Jewish household in the UK. So that's really so we grew up learning about the Holocaust and knowing what had happened to my dad, and and I think that did have quite an impact. I mean, it meant that when I was a teenager, I joined the Labour Party as a teenager, and one of the main things was the sort of determination to fight racism. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was the rise of the National Front, all this sort of thing. And so that was quite that's really I think being opposed to racism was the thing that led me into politics, really. So anyway, I suppose that's my background, that's my childhood. I don't know if that answers the question. But yeah.
Well, it's fascinating to hear, because from what I've researched, your father himself was adopted.
Yeah, well, what happened? It was a private arrangement. It's a really interesting story, actually, because my dad's mum had initially trained as a photographer, and she had I don't really know the detail of all of this, but she had, my understanding is that she had a family friend in Vienna, quite a wealthy family, and they had paid this Englishman, Philip Austin, that's where the name comes from, to take their son away from Vienna to and bring him to England. And now I don't know the detail of this, but the family story is that the Nazis reduced the age limit. He was older than my dad. I think he was 14. He was unable then to travel. And she said to my dad's mum, "Do you want to send Freddie instead? We've got this arrangement. Do you want to send your son?" And they could see, obviously this is late 38, early 39. It's you could see what was happening. And so she decided to send my dad, which is, imagine the bravery. A 10-year-old boy putting him on a train, not knowing if you'll ever see him again. An incredible thing. And that's how he managed to escape. And I often wonder, what happened to the little lad in Vienna?
Yeah.
Did he manage to survive? We don't know anything about him, that family, anything at all. And obviously my dad was 10 when all this happened. And so he wouldn't have, he never knew the detail of all of this. But we went back to, I think the other thing that's interesting about this is that we went back to Ostrava. I took my dad and my eldest 2 kids, and we flew to Prague, and we visited the site of the old synagogue and all that. We went to Theresienstadt, and then we drove all the way over to Ostrava, and we went to various villages and places connected with the family. But in Ostrava, we found a flat where he lived, and he'd arranged for Stolpersteiner, the brass plaques, which are outside the door. And he pointed up at the window on the first floor, and he said, "That's the room that I slept in." And he said that one night, I think if there are any historians on the session, I get the date wrong, please forgive me. I think it's March the 16th. He said that he'd been awoken by noise in the street, and he looked out of the window, and it was the German soldiers marching into the town square, which was just around the corner. And he can remember that happening. And then a few days later, he left. But what's really interesting is that, it's Holocaust Memorial Week this week. And I'm sure lots of people have been going on, attending various ceremonies and commemorations and so on. And when you talk about, and I've visited I've been to Auschwitz with the Holocaust Educational Trust and all this sort of thing. But when you talk about 6 million, it's such a huge figure. But when you go to somewhere like Ostrava, and there were, before the war, thousands of Jewish people, I think 6 synagogues, Jewish schools, businesses, all of this. When you go there today, it's you go and find I've been there a couple of times now, and you go and find the Jewish Community Centre, and it's a sort of building in it's nowhere near the city centre. It's not in the greatest part of town. The synagogue is 1 room or 2 rooms on the first floor, and there are seats for 40 people. And that's when, really we went to a place called Nowy Targ in Poland, where my dad's cousin's family had all lived. And they'd had a shop in the town centre, on the town square, still there. And I think there were, 2,000 Jewish people. You can go to the, what was a synagogue is now a cinema. You go to there's a youth club, and the wall at the back of and that was the building that the Nazis had as their base there. The wall at the back of it was where they shot people. One of my dad's cousins had been dragged out of an attic where he was hiding and was shot. The woman we got a local historian to show us around when we went there, and I said to her, how many Jewish people live here now? And she looked at me as if I was mad, and she said, well, none. And there had been, 2,000 or 3,000 before the war. She said to me, the first people who'd gone back after the war, had been released from the camps and had gone back to Nowy Targ, had been shot by the people in the town who didn't want Jewish people coming back and reclaiming their property and so on. And I think for me, 6 million, it's such a huge figure. You can't really understand that. But when you go to these places, you see the direct, real impact.
Yeah.
A whole community wiped out. I think it really does bring it home. Anyway, so that's a long-winded account of a journey I took with my dad to go and look at all this and find out more about his background. And my dad died a couple of years ago. I'm very pleased that we did that. And my siblings and I have talked about us all going and seeing all that as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
He managed to survive all that, and he himself gave a lot to Dudley.
He did. It's really interesting. This he arrived in the UK at the age of 10, unable even to speak English. He could say 3 words, which were hot, cross, and bun. That's true. But he became the youngest grammar school headmaster in the country. He got the best doctorate of his year in French at a French university. He did French and German. He became a French teacher. When he was in the 50s, when he was becoming a teacher, he was denied. He tried to get a job in one school he tried to get a job as a librarian in the House of Commons, and they wouldn't employ him because he'd been born in what was by then Eastern Europe. So he wasn't allowed to do that. And he tried to get a job as a German teacher in one school and was told by the head teacher that he couldn't have the job because the head teacher couldn't understand that my dad could not just hate Germans after what had happened to his family. But anyway, he became a French teacher. He became the youngest grammar school headmaster in the country. He became the head of the grammar school in Dudley, and did lots of charity work and all sorts of things. I remember, actually, it's very funny. I remember when I was very young, I remember the MP for Dudley at the time was a very grand man, Dr. John Gilbert. I got to know him very well when I was older. He was still the MP. But I remember he came to our house because my dad was setting up the Community Relations Council. So he came to our house one Saturday afternoon to talk to my dad about this. And it was a very exciting, it was like a sort of royal visit. And anyway, I was always pleased that when I went to visit people in Dudley, nobody, it wasn't seen in the same, it wasn't a sort of grand an event. But yeah, so he became involved in all sorts of community things, and yeah, he got an MBE in 2006, I think, 2007, for services to charity and education. So yeah, it's not an unusual story when you look at, the survivors I meet, and they spend all their time, going around schools and colleges and talking to people about the Holocaust and where hatred and prejudice can lead and all that. They are the most British people, the most patriotic, and they've made such a huge contribution to our country. And I really think that, you look at someone like Sir Ben Helfgott, what he's done for Britain, or, Ziggy Shipper, these people. I mean, it is unbelievable, the contribution they've made to Britain.
Yeah,
and
Ziggy is. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, they are, anyway, incredible people. So
Ziggy's one of our members at our community in Radler. He's
okay.
So he's
a great guy. He's a great guy. I rang him up on his birthday. Was it last week or the week before? So I give him a ring from time to time, and I'm very pleased to be able to tell everybody that he's had his first vaccination, and he seemed to be in very good shape. So yeah, lovely, lovely family.
Yeah, so it seems that the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and that idea of fighting back against prejudice shaped a lot of your background. And
look, what I would say about this is, look, what happened to the Labour Party? An organisation with a fine and proud history of fighting racism and fighting for equality and opposing injustice and all of that. What happened to the Labour Party over the last few years, for me, was really shocking. But I would have done, I think, what I did if this had been any community. When I was a student, I volunteered for Searchlight, now Hope Not Hate, in campaigning against, the National Front. When I became an MP, the first thing I did was organise a massive campaign to drive the BNP, who had a local councillor in Dudley, out of the area. And we knocked on every door in the area. We really engaged in local issues and listened to local people. And we persuaded them that, we were the people that were in touch and were answering the questions they got. And we really took on the extremists and won. When the EDL used to come to Dudley in big demonstrations, trying to whip up community tensions over the proposal to build a new mosque, I stood with the Muslim community. I organised rallies against rape. Enoch Powell had been the MP for the neighbouring constituency on the 50th anniversary of the Rivers of Blood speech. I booked the same room in the same hotel in Birmingham and organised a big rally against racism to show that how much the community had changed and become united in the 50 years since that speech, and to celebrate the diversity and unity of communities in the West Midlands. So it's not, for me, this was, it was a fundamental thing, but I would have, if this had been racism against any community, then I would have known whose side I was on, and I would have known what my responsibility was.
Yeah, that comes across strongly. And as you moved into politics in adulthood, and as you joined the Labour Party and you won and you were elected, in September, let's go back to 2019, we're going through the Brexit chaos and not knowing which way it would go. And then in the midst of that, there's this new election that's called in 2019. You have a choice to make, because a lot of people in our community, for example, we have a Q&A on Yom Kippur, the most holy day of the year. And everyone that year and the year before, that was in September-ish, everyone was saying, how can Labour politicians not be more vociferous and speak out against this? And when we saw in the run-up to that election, you in the House of Commons saying what you said to the Labour leadership, and when you went on the news and you said you were resigning, stepping down as a Labour MP to run as an independent, we wanted to shake your hand. And I remember that we met each other when we were working with an organisation called Mainstream, which was again there to try and call out and stand against this type of racism.
Yeah.
You really were a leading light in fighting this and exposing it and standing up for our community, and we'll always be grateful to you for that. I know a lot of people want to say thank you to you.
Look, it's very kind of you, but people shouldn't be thanking. Look, people shouldn't be. People shouldn't be thanking someone who was a Labour MP for standing up to racism. I mean, this should be a basic requirement of the job. It shouldn't be a sort of something that's sort of seen as remarkable, really. I mean, the tragic look. In 2015, when Corbyn was running for the leadership, I mean, at first people just thought, "Oh, who's this irrelevant old guy?" You know, they always have some left-wing candidate; they never get anywhere. And then because of the rule changes, and because for all sorts of reasons, financial crisis, people are angry, young people, students were particularly cheesed off, tuition fees, all these sorts of factors. And the mainstream part of the Labour Party were putting forward candidates who, in both 2010 and 2015, really, who, didn't really have an exciting agenda, new ideas, compelling ways of communicating them. There was this big vacuum. Corbyn filled it. But look, I was saying then, when it became clear that he got a good chance of winning, I was writing articles for the papers saying, talking about his history, Hamas, Hezbollah, saying they're friends, defending people accused of anti-Semitism, the things he'd said about the IRA, all this sort of stuff, his economic agenda, warning of the disaster it would be if he became the leader of the Labour Party. I mean, I was campaigning against him from before he got elected. And I just thought, I thought he was completely unsuited to leading a mainstream political party. I thought he would take it off to the fringes. I thought he didn't have the skills and the ability to lead a political party. Look, they say, "Oh, here's this great man of principle." This is funny, I think. It's not funny; it's a disaster. But who goes through life believing in every respect exactly what they believed 50 years before when they were in their early 20s? I mean, you must be so incurious about the world and so immune to new ideas, and probably so terrified of having a new idea intruded because it might sort of prove you've been wrong about something. I learn new things every day. You listen to people, you learn. People say things to you, you think, "Oh, I didn't know that. Maybe that means I've been wrong about this." You try and sort of, that's life, isn't it? That's part of sort of, but not for. So I thought he was completely unsuited to leading the Labour Party. I thought it would be a disaster. And I campaigned against him from day one. And look, I left the Labour Party in February 2019. When Luciana left, I just thought to myself, I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I was completely estranged from the Labour leadership and becoming, there was no sort of relationship at all. And I thought when Luciana left, I just thought, look, you've got to decide whose side are you on, And if someone like Luciana leaves the Labour Party, then, and I thought, and people said to me, "Oh, look, Ian, why are you doing this? You're not Jewish yourself. Why do you have to do this?" I thought, and my answer to that is, Luciana, Ruth Smeeth, Margaret Hodge, Louise Ellman, they don't have a choice about opposing anti-Semitism. And I thought, if they don't have a choice about it, somebody like me shouldn't have a choice about it either. And I thought this as well, I don't have to be sleeping rough on the streets to be worried about homelessness. I don't have to be unemployed to want to fight for good jobs for people. I don't have to be, I don't have to be Muslim to be opposed to Islamophobia. And I don't have to be Jewish to know that anti-Semitism is wrong. course, you know. And I left. I mean, the other thing was I wanted to try and force other Labour MPs to take action against Corbyn.
Yeah.
And I said to them, I mean, I remember there was a dinner. We had a dinner. There was a whole group of us brought together by Peter Mandelson. And they were all saying, and this was in the summer of 2018, and they were all saying, oh, Ian, you know, there mustn't be a split. It'll let the Tories in. And I said, well, if you're telling me that I shouldn't do something because it'll prevent Jeremy Corbyn winning an election, that's not a discouragement. You know, that's the objective. And I said to them that, I mean, I said to one or two of them, I said, look, you know, you're not going to be a minister in a Jeremy Corbyn government. And I said, well, why not? And I said, because I'm going to do everything I possibly can to prevent it. You know, I did everything I could to try and get Labour MPs to face up to this and to force him out and to avert the disaster. And in the end, when by the summer of 2019, the autumn of 2019, when it was pretty clear an election was coming and Corbyn was going to be leading the Labour Party into it, I thought, well, you know, there's no... no, look, I could have just disappeared off to Dudley, kept my head down, ignored it all. But I thought this had happened on our watch. We had a responsibility for it. The public had to make this choice. You know, they had to decide between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. There are only two people who could be Prime Minister. Now, there's loads of things that Boris Johnson has said and done over the years that I completely disagree with. But in the end, I just thought Jeremy Corbyn is completely unfit to be our country's Prime Minister. Whatever I thought about Boris Johnson, I thought that was a choice you had to make. And so that's why I did what I did. But I could never have imagined being put in that position. The thing is this, you see, if in 2017, Corbyn had done he'd done unexpectedly better than, he'd outperformed expectations in the 2017 election. I mean, Theresa May, look, I get on very well with Theresa May. I admire her in many ways, you know, strong woman, doing her best for the country, determined, you know, got pretty badly treated, I think. But let's be honest, she wasn't the greatest campaigner in that election. And they had a manifesto that was sort of seemed designed to chase the voters away, really. I mean, it was a disaster for the Tories. And so Corbyn did better and, you know, claimed a moral victory and all this. And I thought to myself, well, look, he's got to be beaten as badly as possible in the 2019 election, because if it's close, and at the beginning of the election campaign, you know, the Tory campaign was faltering a little bit and all that. You know, if Boris only won by 10 or 20 seats, Corbyn would have been claiming, you know, a moral victory. We won the argument, all this rubbish. And I just thought they've got to be beaten as badly as possible in the hope that they'll come to their senses. So, you know, that's why I did what I did.
Do you think that the current Labour leadership and the party as a whole is fundamentally different now to the party that harboured Corbyn and all of that nonsense?
Well, I think Keir Starmer, I mean, there is no way you could say Keir Starmer's an extremist. And there's no way you certainly couldn't say that Keir Starmer is an anti-Semite. I mean, you can't say that. I mean, he's not. But he did serve in Corbyn's team. You know, now look, I suppose they took a different view. They thought this had got to work itself out. And if they wanted to save the Labour Party afterwards, they'd have to get the members to vote for them. Whereas I just thought, you've got to drive this guy out from day one. You've got to, you know, you cannot allow this to happen. And he was elected promising sort of unity. Now, I think, look, the history of the Labour Party, it's always had people like Jeremy Corbyn in it, and John McDonnell and Ken Livingstone and those sorts of people. They've always been there, but they've been a sort of irrelevant fringe, really. And they've been sort of tolerated and ignored. I mean, And Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, these people were in the Labour Party under Tony Blair's leadership. But the thing is, I think that, what's the best way of putting this? They're not irrelevant because they ran the Labour Party, and they're not harmless because they did massive damage and huge harm. So they can no longer be tolerated as an irrelevant and harmless fringe because they're not. And I think that, if you want to show the Labour Party's really changed, I think you've got to get people like Corbyn out of it. I mean, who's to say if they lost an election or there was a vacancy for the leadership, who's to say that they couldn't, that the membership wouldn't elect another sort of extremist in future? So that's why I think, and people say to me, are you going to go back to the Labour Party? I don't want to be in the same political party as Jeremy Corbyn. I don't want to be in the same political party as all sorts of people. I mean, I don't want to say this about all the people who supported Corbyn because it wouldn't be fair. And there are lots of young people who got sort of swept up in this, who would otherwise have been perfectly decent. They've had a reasonable introduction to politics. They'd be campaigning on things like homelessness or food poverty or food banks or whatever it might be. But they got sort of swept along in this whole Corbyn thing. That's really actually, I think, one of the worst aspects of all of this. So I don't want to say everybody who joined to support Corbyn, but I mean, he brought in lots of people from the fringes who had no place in the Labour Party. And until those people are driven out, then, I think there's quite a bit of work to be done. But look, they seem to be getting to grips with it. They seem to be suspending people now responsible for anti-Semitism, although probably not in the numbers that are necessary yet. But, it's in much better shape than it was under Corbyn. But I think there's a long way to go. They're not there yet.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Well, it's worrying, but thank God, when as a community, we're not in the same sense of, or the same place of fear that we were gripped by at that time, when we were facing a possible Corbyn government, which at the time didn't have much good news for our community.
Sorry to interrupt, Rabbi Hughes, but this is a really terrible thing when you think about it. I mean, the Jewish community in Britain ought to be deciding who wants to run the country based on, do I agree with their policies?
Yeah.
What do I think of what they're saying about education or the health service or housing or the economy or whatever it might be? Instead of which, it's a sort of it's a fundamental question. I mean, that is a terrible situation. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. And it is. I mean, it's a complete disgrace that one of Britain's communities found itself in that position, and it's absolutely outrageous that people in the Labour Party, Corbyn supporters, wouldn't listen to that. But there's a sort of blind spot on the left. I mean, people like Corbyn. I mean, they really believe Corbyn. This is incredible. Corbyn actually thinks he's the victim. His sense of his own virtue, he thinks he's a good anti-racist who's fought racism all his life. How can this possibly be true? How can this possibly be true? And racism, he thinks, is not something people like him do. Racism is something those terrible right-wing people do. That's the Tories. It's not possible for us to be racist. We're good people. We're virtuous. We're on the left. That's what he genuinely thinks. And that leads them onto this analysis then that it's got to be bad faith. These allegations have got to be, they're untrue. Therefore, it must be a smear and a plot and a conspiracy. That's what they think. And then some of them think, why is this smear and plot and conspiracy being mounted? I mean, I've had people say to me, oh, you're only doing this because, it's rich people who don't want to pay their taxes. the age-old tropes about Jews and wealth, or it's all a conspiracy. The age-old tropes about Jewish people manipulating politics, or it's, or of course, they say, oh, it's because Corbyn is pro-Palestinian, and that's really what it's all about. I mean, and this obsession in the Labour, this obsession on the left now about Israel. I mean, when I look at, I get a lot of abuse on social media. When I look at it, all the people, so many of them, so many of them have got this sort of Palestinian flag as their little, it's how they sort of identify, self-identity, that's part of their identity in politics. And it's become an obsession. And that, I think, is this is the point I was making earlier about young people being dragged into, the impact it's had on politics and the way it's poisoned people's attitudes. That I think is the really unforgivable thing about Corbyn's tenure. Really shocking.
And you mentioned young people there, and I read some of the minutes from the recent discussions in the House of Lords that you've been involved in, and some very shocking comments that came recently that the reason for anti-Semitism on campus was because of Israel's nefarious actions, and therefore anti-Jewish racism is the Jews' fault. Yeah,
I know. Well, it was Baroness Tong who said this. And I said I altered, it was a short debate, it was only an hour, and we were given 1 minute each. But I altered what I was going to say and said at the end of my remarks that I thought it was completely wrong to see her blaming racism against Jewish people, not on the racist responsible, but on Israel. Completely unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. Look, anti-Semitism changes over the centuries, doesn't it? It manifests itself in different ways. And today, a lot of it is about this obsession and hatred with Israel. They hold Israel to standards they would never hold any other country. Israel is singled out for criticism that is never applied to anybody else. When they say, oh, look, I'm anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist, who do they think lives in Israel? Who do they think lives there? And what does that mean? If you say, oh, I'm anti-Zionist, so which other countries are you against the existence of? What a thing. And if the only country that you think should be abolished is a Jewish one, don't tell me you're not an anti-Semite.
And it's the only Jewish one.
Yeah, completely. And it's the only, and it's actually, by the way, the only democracy in the Middle East. The only democracy in the Middle East. Hundreds of millions of Arab citizens in 24 countries, and the only ones that get to elect their government are the ones living in Israel.
Yeah.
Well, they do in Iraq. Okay, but the only one you could really say is a functioning democracy,
transparent democracy.
Society. Yeah.
Yeah, I lived in Israel for 8 years, and I met with Palestinian business people. In fact, it was our chief rabbi who brought out a lot of us, the rabbis in his rabbinate, to them. We sat down one evening talking to Palestinian business people, and they love doing business in Israel. They want peace. They wanted prosperity, and they're frustrated by their own leadership.
Yeah.
For blocking and thwarting and teaching children to hate, and it's something that we saw, we spoke, we met these people, and it is something which people aren't educated about enough, and I think that the younger generation they have a moral responsibility to learn about the whole story, and not just to hear one-sided narratives. And I think
unfortunately, it is. look, it's hugely difficult. I mean, it's a massively complicated problem, isn't it? And but we've got to be. I mean, there are majorities on both sides that still favour peace, and a peaceful two-state solution to this conflict. And this has almost worked in the past, and but it is, there's got to be leaderships on both sides that are, and look, you look at the behaviour of the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, and you look at what's happened look at what happened in Gaza. Israel withdrew, and you end up with an Iranian armed militia taking over, brutal regime, firing rockets at Israeli civilians. Look what happened in Lebanon. Israel withdrew, and you end up with an Iranian armed militia firing rockets at Israeli civilians. I mean, it's a hugely difficult, and the existential threat that Israel faces. It's tragically, Israel's gone from being being seen as the David to being seen as the Goliath. And it's gone from being the sort of social democratic dream and all that. But look, I go there a lot, and I think it's a remarkable country. I think what's been achieved is incredible, and I think the recent peace deals, the Abraham Accords, are extraordinary. I mean, a massive step forward. Who could have predicted this? I mean, I've been in meetings, virtual meetings, with the ambassador from the UAE and the ambassador and Zippy Hotovela. I mean, who would have thought in November that was going to be happening? It's an incredible thing, thing. And that's got to give us a lot of, that's got to give people confidence and hope that things can change and, progress can be achieved. Amazing.
And so currently, then, what are your plans in public life, and what are you I'm still hoping to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I'm enjoying life in the House of Lords. People say to me, oh, Ian, this is ridiculous. You get appointed. The other day I was, I put something on, on Twitter about elections, and I get all these responses back saying, "How can you say that when you've been appointed to the House of Lords?" I think the way it works is that, everybody, everyone thinks it's indefensible until you get nominated, and then you come up with all these reasons why it works really well. Sorry, I shouldn't joke about this. I think I want to carry on. I'm very interested in education. I mean, that's always been the number one domestic issue for me. I think there's nothing more important than educating young people. I think education should be our country's number one priority. And I think that's not just a question of enabling young people to fulfill their potential and get good jobs and all that, but it's actually crucial for the country in the modern economy. I mean, the jobs you get, whether it's an individual or a community or a country, depend on the skills and knowledge you've got in a sort of modern high-tech economy. And we're going to see that more and more. I mean, the pace of change is going to get faster and faster. New technologies are going to be invented that aren't yet imagined. And young people have got to be able to adapt. I mean, the old days when you've got a set of skills that equip you for a sort of job for life. I mean, obviously, for you, with your rabbinical training, it's different. But for most people, the old days when you got a job, when you went to work in a factory or whatever, and you were there for the rest of your life, that's gone for good. Young people are going to have, a dozen, 20 different jobs over their lifetime. And the thing they need to learn is how to adapt, how to learn, how to acquire new skills. So I think for me, the key thing is education. And I think what's happened in the lockdown, and as a result of COVID, is a catastrophe for education. So I think the number one thing I want to concentrate in the House of Lords domestically is education. And then I'm very interested in international stuff as well. And I'm the UK trade envoy to Israel. So it's my job to promote trade, promote British trade in Israel, promote Israeli investment in Britain. And that's worth, thousands of jobs in Britain. And I want to do all I can to, to bring our countries closer together and to sort of promote those trading links. So yeah, there's lots to keep me busy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wanted to take some questions from the audience,
Sure.
and one that I can see is that one person asked, Ian, did you ever feel fear or scared when you stood up vociferously against the Labour leadership at that time? Were you ever worried about the hate that you would face?
No, not really. Well, no, not really. I think look, I get loads of abuse on social media. You just got to ignore it. I mean, it's horrible. People think they can say whatever they like. I mean, and it is disgusting, some of it, but you've just got to, let that go. There was a period when there was a period when I started getting demonstrations outside my surgeries, which were supposedly about Israel and Palestine, and these weren't. I mean, there were some people in the Labour Party, Corbyn supporters, but there were people from the SWP, and they were sort of winding up young people. I mean, and that was. I mean, there was an occasion when, I came out of the. I was taking my youngest son to watch Villa play at West Brom on a Friday night, and we came out of the library, and I was being picked up by my wife and son. We were going to drive to the game, and she was going to drop us off, and we found ourselves. I was followed to the car, and the car was surrounded with placards and all that, and that's pretty unpleasant. I mean, when you've got a 13-year-old sitting in the back of the car, it's not very nice.
Yeah.
And finding myself being shouted at outside my surgeries. On one occasion, I was told that I can't remember if I was being paid by the Zionists to help the Jews, or if I was being paid by the Jews to help the Zionists. I can't remember which way around it was. But I mean, that's, it's not very pleasant. But I think the thing that surprised me is that, I mean, look, I'm from Dudley. I grew up there. We lived there. I was on the council. Thousands of local people know the family because of my dad and the head teacher and all that. And so being the MP in 2005, it was, a lovely thing. And everywhere I went, I got on with everybody, and I got on with the political opponents, and even people who didn't really, some people in the Labour Party didn't agree with all my views on things, but everybody got on, and we worked together, and we campaigned together, and everything was fine. And then all of a sudden, in 2015, this sort of poison emerges, and this bitterness and hatred, this division. And I wasn't frightened, but it was pretty shocking.
Yeah. Yeah. And another one.
Politics has been, and look, we've seen this in. I think there's a real. I mean, look. Obviously, we've not had Parliament invaded, 5 deaths, riots, all that. We haven't had that. We haven't. We have had senior people in the Labour Party praising violent street protest. I mean, John McDonnell praised people who attacked the Tory party's offices at Millbank on a demonstration. I think we've had senior people in the Labour Party who supported the IRA.
Yeah,
I think that I don't think in the end there's much difference between, I mean, there's certainly a difference in the outcome, but I don't think there's much difference in the attitudes between Donald Trump saying the election was stolen and people around Corbyn saying we'd have won the election in 2017 if there hadn't been a conspiracy by Labour MPs and to undermine our campaign. I mean, there's not much of a difference between those attitudes. There's not much of a difference. When I go to the States a lot, and I remember in 2014 meeting Republican congressmen, and they'd be telling me, oh, you know, this whole Tea Party thing is terrible. It's dragging the Republican Party off to the right, this populist movement. They're trying to get rid of us all. And then a few years later, you go back, you see exactly the same individual people saying, praising Trump. Now, there's not much difference between them and Labour MPs who knew Corbyn was wrong, but went along with it all. You know, kept their heads down to keep their jobs. So I do think there's a sort of, I think what's happening in politics is that certainly in the States, people in the Democratic Party being dragged off to the left and people in the Republican Party being dragged off to the right. Whereas most of the public, actually, most reasonable people are in the centre ground. Now, fortunately, you know, we've got rid of Corbyn. People who supported him haven't gone yet. I think there's a real responsibility in British politics to stand up for our democracy, to stand up for the institutions that underpin it, to argue for moderation and sort of mainstream values and reason, and, you know, not to assume that the other side's terrible, they're all completely wrong, you know, your opponents are evil, all that. You know, that's not, in the end, I think we've got to find our way through in an increasingly polarized and divided society. We've got a responsibility to try and sort of bring people together and unite in the centre ground. You know, politics for me is about listening to other people, trying to find answers, reasonable answers based on your values to their concerns, finding compromise. You know, that's really, I think, look, fundamentally, what's politics about? The reason we have politicians is to try and come up with answers to the difficult questions society faces, to try and find a way through, to listen to people and come up with compromises. That's really what politics is about for me.
Yeah. I think that's very important. I have another question here from friend Jonathan Metlis, who asks, do you think that the extreme left-wing bigotry that emerged, as you've described this evening, do you think that was a reaction to the Blairite years? That was very much centre ground politics. Do you think that these things just work in those cycles and reactions?
No, I don't think it was a reaction to the, well, I think what happened is, look, you know, Labour was in power for 13 years. It made some, you know, make some mistakes. But I think if it hadn't been for the financial crisis, you know, Labour might have hung on in 2010. I think the Labour Party sort of departed from the centre ground, and it moved away from New Labour, the sort of centre ground, a bit to the left, and it lost, and then bizarrely decided to move further to the left and lost again. And instead of thinking maybe we should go back to the centre ground where we won 3 elections, it sort of turbocharged it and elected Jeremy Corbyn, and hey presto, had the worst election result for 85 years. So I think what happened is that I think the mainstream of the Labour Party didn't have interesting ideas, exciting ways of communicating them. I think was complacent, didn't defend its record in government. I mean, there were sort of rule changes and all that. I think young people were cheesed off about tuition fees. I think some people were very angry about Iraq. I think all these things But look, if you lose an election, as we did in the Labour Party to Jeremy Corbyn in 2015, you have to take responsibility for that. You can't blame the winners. I mean, if you lose, it's your fault. But look, I think we made a mistake in undermining Tony Blair and his record. I think that was a mistake. he's, the last time the Labour Party won an election without Tony Blair was in 1974. It was in the mid-70s. And the Labour Party's record of winning elections is pretty lamentable. It's been in existence for about 120 years. And I think it's had about, 26 years of majority government in that time.
Not much.
So, it's, I think that it's really difficult for the Labour Party to win elections in Britain. I think people if you're in your sort of 40s, you're a teenager when John Major was Prime Minister and Black Wednesday, they went behind in the opinion polls, and then they were behind in the opinion polls pretty much consistently until Tony Blair got elected, and then you had 13 years of Labour government. And so I think people think that it's easier than it is. But really, Tony Blair winning 3 elections, that the Labour Party has never achieved that in history. 3 elections consecutively. My seat was highly marginal. We lost lots of similar seats in 2010. Dudley used to have 4 Labour MPs. We lost 3 of them in 2010, and I hung on by 600 votes. And then I had a good result in 2015. In 2017, I won by 22 votes. But I had 22 votes. But lots of people know Lucy Fraser. She's the MP for somewhere in Cambridgeshire. She said to me in 2017, "Oh, congratulations, Ian. What's your majority?" I said, "Oh, well done to you." I said, she said, "What's your majority?" I said, 22. I said, "What's yours?" She said, she said, "A mere 13. Or 17 or something." And then I realised she meant 17,000. I said, "No, Lucy, I mean 22." She got about 22,000. But no, 22 votes. 22 votes. And the thing is, and Dudley's a place, the old outweigh the young. It voted 71% for Brexit. It's so typical of the sort of red wall seats. In 2019, he had the biggest swing in the country to the Conservatives, and the new Tory MPs got a majority of 12,000 votes. Now, the lesson for me is, I was prepared. How did I hang on? By listening to people in Dudley, being prepared to answer difficult questions. If people in Dudley were concerned about the levels of immigration, I didn't say, "You're a racist." I tried to come up with reasonable answers about more training for young people, clamping down on dodgy landlords, exploiting migrant labour, all sorts of reasonable answers to people's concerns. But I had to work really hard to eliminate every possible barrier to people voting for me. And that's what the Labour Party's got to do to win elections. And I don't really think they understand just how tough it is. It's going to be very difficult for the Labour Party to win some of these seats back. They haven't just got to win back the seats they lost in 2019 in the worst result for 85 years. They've got to win back the seats they lost in 2017, 2015, and 2010. So it's going to be very difficult. Look, even after Iraq, Tony Blair won in 2005 with a 65-seat majority. So that doesn't say to me that Tony Blair was this sort of hugely unpopular figure who was unelectable. That was after Iraq.
Right. I have one last question for you. This is from David Landsberg, and he going back to a topic you covered before, but it's a more direct question this time. That he asks, Ian, do you think that Keir Starmer has, to this date, done enough to eradicate anti-Semitism from the Labour Party?
Look, I think he's made some progress. Has he done enough? I think the job's not yet done. I mean, they've got to kick out all the people responsible for anti-Semitism. There's got to be a completely zero tolerance approach to it. There were some figures published last week that showed that I think they're expelling about 38% of cases, and some of them were just getting warning letters and things. I mean, I don't know the detail, but that doesn't, I'm a bit nervous about that. I think they've got to really deal with this obsession about Israel. I mean, the Labour Party's got to, I think the leadership have got to make it really clear that, if you think Israel's this huge problem and you've got this obsession with it and all that, then you're in the wrong party. We've got to get back to a reasonable debate and a Labour leadership that supports Israel in the way that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did. So I think that's, look, I want to be fair to the guy. He's much better than Corbyn. He's not an extremist. He's not an anti-Semite. But has the problem been solved yet? No, it hasn't. And I think kicking out Corbyn for good would go a long way to showing that the Labour Party was really changing.
Thank you for that. It's Holocaust Memorial Day tomorrow, and we're running out of time this evening. But we know that you've been organising a memorial event in Dudley, and you told me that there aren't many Jewish people there, if any at all, and you're having a Holocaust memorial event there. Just from your unique perspective, Ian, and again, thank you for everything you've done and that you are doing, not just in terms of anti-Semitism, but also all the good values that you promote. Could you leave maybe our audience with a message relating to the Holocaust and how we can still learn its lessons?
Sure. Look, I think the thing that I would say is, look, normally in Dudley, at our Holocaust commemoration, we have 400 people. And this is a community with no Jewish people at all. And really, it's an anti-racism event. And they come along, they listen to a survivor. And Ziggy's been to Dudley twice to talk it in, and we're doing it online this week, obviously for obvious reasons. But when I stood up against Corbyn and the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, ordinary people in Dudley backed me 100%. People stopped me in the street. I remember I was in the opticians, in the dentist. The guy in the opticians, he said to me, he said, I don't know much about politics. He said, but I've been following what you've been saying about this. I'm in a cycling club. A guy on a bike ride said to me, Ian, it's 2018. What's going on? Ordinary people. And this is what I would say. That I think that people in the Jewish community should know this, that the election in 2019 and that record defeat that Labour suffered, there were lots of factors. I mean, Brexit obviously was a big issue. Corbyn's complete unsuitability to lead our country was obviously a major factor. But anti-Semitism was definitely an issue. There's no question about that. In communities with no Jewish people at all, ordinary people in Britain just thought, this is wrong. They don't know the detail, the theory, the history of anti-Semitism, but they knew something had gone wrong and they didn't like it. And I think, and that is, I promise you, it was definitely a factor in Labour's defeat. And I think that should give us hope and confidence for the future, that people in Britain who've never met, lots of them in communities with no Jewish people, many of them have never met a Jewish person in their lives. They thought this was racism and they didn't like it and they voted against the Labour Party. One of the reasons they voted against the Labour Party was because of this. And I think it's a great thing about our country that ordinary people in Britain stood up for the Jewish community and said, we're not having this. And I think that should give us hope and confidence for the future.
Thank you. And Thank you so much for your time, your insight,
Well,
your commentary, and your good humour. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Ian. And thank you as ever
no,
for
well,
everything that you.
thank you very much. And thanks to Hannah for organising this, and thanks to everybody who's been listening. And keep up the good work.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to reiterate the thanks to our technical support. Hannah, thank you for all you do. And just to the audience then, we're going to close now. Thanks to Ian. Thank you all for joining us. And it's been very meaningful. We can learn these lessons, live these lessons. And as we think about Holocaust Memorial Day tomorrow, we can remember, reflect, but also, please God, be hopeful for a brighter future where we can live in peace and happiness with each other, and please God, in good health. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.